September 17, 1943. The law office of Harlan T. Jessup occupied the third floor of a brick building on Market Street in Baltimore, Maryland. Harlan stared at 4 manila folders arranged in a neat row across his mahogany desk. 4 estate cases. 4 different people. 1 address, 412 Hollins Street. 1 name in the beneficiary line, Vera Louise Carmody. 4 apartments in a single 5-story walk-up. All owners deceased within 18 months. Every will perfectly executed, witnessed properly, signed in sound mind and body. Everything entirely lawful. But something about these folders reeked, not of paper and ink, but of something else, something that made his chest tighten with cold dread. Harlan opened the first folder and began reading again, though he knew the contents by heart. He didn't yet understand that in 3 weeks he'd be standing in the hallway of that cursed building, listening to sounds from apartment 5B that would rob him of peaceful sleep for years to come. Harlan Theodore Jessup was 52 years old. He'd practiced estate law for 26 years, since 1917, when he'd returned from the Great War and passed the Maryland bar. His practice specialized in wills, probate, estate planning, the quiet machinery that kept property moving from one generation to the next. For 2 decades, he drafted thousands of documents: wills, trusts, powers of attorney, inheritance petitions. The work had become routine, pleasant, and predictable. Each morning, he arrived at his office at 8 sharp, settled into his chair by the window overlooking the harbor, and immersed himself in the orderly world of testamentary language and probate procedures. His life moved with the regularity of a clock. His wife Dorothy taught piano lessons from their row house in Federal Hill. Their daughter Agnes worked as a riveter at the Bethlehem Fairfield shipyards, doing her part for the war effort. Evenings they gathered around the radio, listening to war news and comedy programs, drinking weak wartime coffee. Harlan never brought work home, never discussed cases. The files stayed at the office, and home remained a sanctuary. But today he couldn't stop thinking about these 4 folders. The first case appeared in March 1942, the will of Bertram Willis Stanhope, 74 years old, residing in apartment 1C at 412 Hollins Street. A solitary retiree, former railway clerk, veteran of the Spanish-American War. No children, wife deceased a decade prior. The will was straightforward. All property, including his 1-bedroom apartment, left to Vera Louise Carmody, who, as stated in the document, had cared for him during his final months. The old man came to Harlan's office himself, gaunt, stooped, hands trembling, voice barely a whisper. Harlan remembered him. Bertram sat across the desk, laboriously signing the document, saying, __quote_0___. Harlan saw nothing unusual. He'd drafted dozens of such wills. Lonely, elderly people leaving property to neighbors, caretakers, distant cousins. It was normal. Bertram Stanhope died in July 1942. Death certificate listed the cause: congestive heart failure. He was 74, an age when the heart could simply stop without warning. Vera Carmody came to file the probate paperwork in August. Harlan remembered her. A woman of about 37, with regular features, dark auburn hair pulled into a severe bun, and eyes that looked directly at you with unsettling calm. She wore a modest navy dress, no jewelry except a thin wedding band. She spoke quietly, politely, answered questions precisely without elaboration. Her documents were immaculate. She worked as a practical nurse at Union Memorial Hospital, was married, no children. Mr. Stanhope was a good man, she'd said. Harlan processed the probate, issued the inheritance certificates. The case closed. An ordinary story. The second case arrived in November 1942. Winifred Octavia Pemberton, 69 years old, apartment 7A, same building at 412 Hollins. Widow, former seamstress, lifetime Baltimore resident. No children. Will naming Vera Louise Carmody as sole beneficiary. Winifred came to Harlan's office in September 1942, 2 months before her death. a tiny bird-like woman with gnarled fingers and eyes clouded by cataracts. She explained that Miss Vera had been helping her since a stroke left her partially paralyzed, assisting with cleaning, escorting her to medical appointments. "I want the apartment to go to her," Winifred said. "I have nobody else, and Vera's been like a daughter to me." Harlan prepared the will. 2 months later, Winifred died. Cause of death, second stroke. In January 1943, Vera Carmody returned to file probate. Harlan remembered her sitting across from him, same calm eyes, same measured courtesy. "Mrs. Pemberton asked me to arrange for burial next to her husband in Loudon Park," Vera said. "I honored her wishes." Harlan processed the inheritance. The case closed. At that point, he still hadn't noticed the pattern. 2 estate cases within months, not uncommon. Lonely, elderly people, same caretaker, coincidence. The third case emerged in April 1943. Fletcher Randolph Hutchins, 78 years old, apartment 12D, 412 Hollins Street. Retired postal worker, widower, childless. Will naming Vera Louise Carmody as beneficiary. Fletcher came to Harlan's office in February 1943. Tall, hunched, head trembling, signs of Parkinson's disease. He could barely hold the pen. His signature came out crooked, barely legible, but Harlan verified he was of sound mind and acting of his own volition, Fletcher said. Fletcher died in April. Cause: pneumonia complicated by general systemic failure. In May, Vera Carmody came to file probate for the third time. That's when Harlan first felt the strangeness. He sat across from her, watching her methodically present documents, and suddenly felt mildly nauseous. 3 people, 1 building, 1 beneficiary, 3 deaths in a year. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but Vera looked up, and he saw something in her eyes that made him stop. Not a threat, not fear, just emptiness. She regarded him the way one regards an object, an obstacle to be navigated on the path to a goal. Harlan processed the documents silently, but after she left, he retrieved the first 2 case files from storage and placed them beside the third. He began comparing dates, addresses, names. The pattern became obvious. The 4th case arrived in September 1943. Constance Beatrice Howell, 83 years old, apartment 19C, 412 Hollins Street. Will naming Vera Louise Carmody. Constance died in August. Cause: senile dementia and heart failure. She'd executed the will in June, 2 months before death. Now, September 17, 1943, Harlan sat at his desk staring at 4 folders, 4 apartments, 18 months, 1 beneficiary. He took a sheet of paper and began listing dates. Bertram Stanhope, will March 1942, death July 1942, interval 4 months. Winifred Pemberton, will September 1942, death November 1942, interval 2 months. Fletcher Hutchins, will February 1943, death April 1943, interval 2 months. Constance Howell, will June 1943, death August 1943, interval 2 months. He stared at the list and felt something inside him turn to ice. The intervals were too uniform, too predictable, as if someone were working on a schedule. After the first case, which might have been experimental, all subsequent cases followed the same timeline. 2 months from will to death. Harlan rose from his desk and walked to the window. Outside was a bright September day, Baltimore gleaming in sunlight, people walking the sidewalks, talking, laughing. An ordinary day. But inside him, dread grew, heavy and viscous as motor oil. He returned to the desk, opened the first folder, and reread the medical documentation. Bertram Stanhope, congestive heart failure. Winifred Pemberton, second stroke. Fletcher Hutchins, pneumonia. Constance Howell, dementia and cardiac arrest. All causes appeared natural, all signed by physicians, everything lawful. But 412 Hollins Street had 24 apartments. 4 now belonged to Vera Carmody. How many other apartments housed solitary elderly residents? Harlan picked up the telephone, dialed the city records office, waited for an answer. __quote _9 __. An hour later, a clerk delivered a copy of the building register. Harlan spread the pages across his desk. 24 apartments, 89 registered residents, 38 of retirement age. He began crossing out those living with family, those with children or grandchildren. 7 solitary elderly people remained, 4 already dead, 3 still living. Apartment 5B. Delphine Marigold Crenshaw, 75, widow. Apartment 11A. Ernest Sylvester Blackwood, 71, bachelor. Apartment 16C. Wilhelmina Frances Dalton, 80, widow. 3. The last 3. Harlan looked at the list and thought, which one is next? His hand trembled as he returned the documents to their folder. This was no longer coincidence. This was a system. Vera Carmody was systematically selecting lonely elderly people, gaining their trust, obtaining wills, and waiting. Waiting for them to die. Or perhaps not merely waiting, perhaps helping the process along. He locked the folders in his safe, put on his jacket, and left the office. The street was hot, air smelling of Chesapeake brine and diesel exhaust. Harlan took the streetcar to the Hollins Street stop. His heart beat faster than usual. He didn't know exactly what he planned to do, but he needed to see this building with his own eyes. Needed to understand what happened behind those walls. Number 412 was a typical 5-story brick walk-up from the 1890s. Weathered red brick, iron fire escapes, windows framed with limestone. The lobby smelled of cabbage and floor wax. Harlan slowly climbed to the second floor, examining mailboxes, nameplates on doors. Apartment 1C, Stanhope. He remembered old Bertram sitting in his office, trembling hands signing the will. Now a new lock gleamed on the door, freshly installed. Vera had already taken possession. Harlan found apartment 5B. The nameplate read, Crenshaw, DM. He knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Silence. He pressed his ear to the door. Inside was quiet, only the faint hiss of steam radiators. He climbed to the 3rd floor, to apartment 11A. Blackwood, ES. He knocked. Behind the door came shuffling sounds, then the scrape of a chain lock. The door opened a crack. An elderly man's face appeared in the gap. Sharp nose, graying stubble, suspicious eyes. Quote 10, quote, he rasped. Quote 11, quote. The old man regarded him with distrust. The door slammed. Harlan heard locks clicking inside, one after another. The old man was clearly frightened. But of what? Or whom? Harlan climbed to the 4th floor, to apartment 16C. Dalton, WF. He knocked. Inside came slow footsteps, then a voice. Quote 15, quote 16. The lock clicked and the door opened. A small elderly woman with white hair and kind face stood on the threshold. Quote 17, she smiled. Quote 18. Harlan entered the apartment. It was clean, smelling of lavender and old books. Photographs in frames covered the walls. Young Wilhelmina in a wedding dress, a man in a doughboy uniform, children. A life lived within these walls. Wilhelmina led him to the sitting room, gestured to a horsehair sofa, settled herself in a worn armchair. Quote 19. Quote. The old woman's face brightened. Oh, of course. Miss Vera is such a wonderful woman. She cared for Mr. Stanhope in 1C, then Mrs. Pemberton, then Mr. Hutchins. Now she's helping poor Delphine in 5B. The Lord sent her to our building. She made the sign of the cross. Harlan felt his breath catch. Helping Delphine from apartment 5B? Yes, poor dear's taken a bad turn. Diabetes, kidneys failing. Miss Vera comes every day to give her insulin injections, prepare meals. Delphine says without Miss Vera, she'd already be dead. Harlan felt the room tilt. Mrs. Dalton, has Miss Vera ever offered to help you? Oh, yes, many times. Such a thoughtful woman. But I told her I'm managing fine on my own. My daughter lives in Towson, visits every Sunday. I don't need help yet, thank the Lord. If she ever suggests you make a will in her favor, Mrs. Dalton, please come see me first. Promise me. Wilhelmina's smile faded. Her eyes narrowed with sudden understanding. Harlan paused, choosing words carefully. He left his card on her side table and departed. His legs shook as he climbed to the 5th floor. Apartment 5B. He stood before the door, listening. Inside, he heard movement, then voices. 2 women speaking. One voice weak and plaintive, the other soft, soothing, relentless as dripping water. He couldn't make out words, but the rhythm was hypnotic, like a lullaby, or an incantation. He knocked sharply. The voices stopped instantly. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Vera Carmody stood on the threshold. She wore a white nurse's uniform, hair pulled back, hands immaculate. Behind her, Harlan glimpsed a dim apartment, a figure in a bed, bottles lined up on a nightstand. Vera looked at him with those empty eyes, and for a moment, neither spoke. Quote 29, she said finally. Her voice was calm as still water. A cold smile touched her lips. Harlan looked past her into the apartment. Quote 36, quote 37. Vera's voice sharpened slightly. You're disturbing my patient. I'll have to ask you to leave. Has Mrs. Crenshaw executed a will? Vera's expression didn't change. That's between Mrs. Crenshaw and her attorney. Good day, Mr. Jessup. She closed the door in his face. He heard the lock turn. Harlan stood in the hallway, breathing hard. Behind him came the sound of a door opening. He turned. An elderly woman stood in the doorway of 5A, watching him. You the lawyer? She asked. Yes, ma'am. That Vera woman's a devil. The neighbors spoke in a fierce whisper. Been watching her for months. She moves into this building like she lives here, but she don't. Comes every day, stays hours. Heard her in there talking to Delphine. Hour after hour. Talking and talking. Delphine used to be strong, feisty. Now she just lays there like a ghost. Whatever that woman's doing to her, it ain't nursing. Have you called the police? And tell them what? That a woman's being too nice to an old lady? They'd laugh me out of the station. She shook her head. You can't stop her, mister. Nobody can. She's like a spider. Sits there waiting, and the fly just walks right into the web. Harlan left the building, his mind racing. Back at his office, he went through the case files again, this time looking for something, anything, that might constitute evidence of wrongdoing. But the documents were flawless. Every will properly executed, every death certified by a physician, all causes natural. Heart failure, stroke, pneumonia, age. How do you prove murder when there's no physical evidence? When the weapon is words whispered day after day into the ears of the frightened and lonely? He called Detective Morris Blanchard at Central Station, an old friend from his Army days. They met for coffee at Lexington Market. Harlan spread the case files across the table. __quote _48 __. Morris examined the documents, sipping his coffee. He was a heavy-set man with a florid face and tired eyes. 20 years on the force had taught him to see patterns. Quote, 49, quote, he read aloud. Quote, 50, quote, 51, quote, 52, quote, 53, quote, 54, quote, 55, quote. Morris closed the folders and pushed them back across the table. He leaned forward. Morris stood up. Harlan sat alone at the table long after Morris left. He thought about the sound of Vera's voice through that door. Soft, soothing, endless, like water wearing away stone. How do you kill someone with words? How do you rob them of the will to live without ever laying a hand on them? That evening, he told Dorothy everything. They sat in their parlor, blackout curtains drawn against the wartime restrictions, speaking in low voices. Dorothy listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What will you do?" she finally asked. "I don't know. The police won't help. There's no evidence. Everything's legal. But you know something's wrong." "Yes, but knowing and proving are different things." Dorothy took his hand. "Then you do what you can. You warn the ones who are still alive. You make it harder for her. Maybe you can't stop her completely, but you can slow her down. Save who you can save." The next morning, Harlan returned to 412 Hollins. He went to apartment 11A and knocked until Ernest Blackwood answered. The old man opened the door with the chain still on. "You again." "Mr. Blackwood, please listen. I have reason to believe that Vera Carmody is targeting elderly residents of this building. 4 people have died after making wills in her favor. I think you might be next." "Get off my doorstep, you lunatic." The door slammed. Harlan went to 16C. Wilhelmina Dalton let him in, her face troubled. "Mr. Jessup, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. You believe Miss Vera is... what? Killing people?" "I believe she's manipulating them. I can't prove how. But Mrs. Dalton, I'm begging you, if she approaches you, if she offers help, refuse it. And under no circumstances should you make a will in her favor." "But surely if she's dangerous, the police..." "The police can't act without evidence. That's why I'm here, to warn you." Wilhelmina's hands trembled as she poured tea. Quote 75, quote 76, quote 77, quote 78, quote 79. Wilhelmina said suddenly. Quote 80, quote. It was a fragile hope, but Harlan seized it. They walked together to Dr. Ashford's residence, a narrow row house on Montgomery Street. The doctor was an elderly man himself, retired from active practice but still seeing a few old patients. He remembered Delphine Crenshaw. Good woman. Haven't seen her in months. That nurse of hers, Carmody is it? Handles everything now. "That's what concerns us," Harlan said. "We think Mrs. Crenshaw might be in danger." Dr. Ashford looked at him sharply. "What kind of danger?" Harlan explained the pattern of deaths, the wills, the timeline. Dr. Ashford's expression grew darker. Quote 85, quote, he said slowly. Quote 86, quote. He shook his head. Quote 87, quote. But when Dr. Ashford arrived at apartment 5B, Vera Carmody refused him entry. She told him through the door. The door remained closed. Dr. Ashford reported back to Harlan. Quote 92, quote 93, quote 94. Dr. Ashford spread his hands helplessly. Quote 95, quote. Days passed. Harlan couldn't sleep. He'd lie awake, thinking about Delphine Crenshaw alone in that apartment with Vera Carmody. What words was Vera speaking to her in the darkness? What fears was she amplifying? What will to live was she slowly, methodically extinguishing? He tried other approaches. He contacted the apartment building's landlord, Morris Greenberg, who owned several properties in the neighborhood. Greenberg was sympathetic but practical. "Mr. Jessup, Miss Carmody pays her rent on time, doesn't cause trouble. Unless you can show me she's breaking the law, I can't evict her. And these old folks leaving her their apartments? That's their choice. Free country. 4 deaths in 18 months isn't suspicious to you? It's an old building, Mr. Jessup. Old people die. That's what they do." Greenberg lit a cigar. "Look, I understand you're concerned, but I run a business. I can't go around making accusations without proof. Bad for reputation. You bring me evidence of criminal activity, we'll talk. Until then, my hands are tied. Everywhere Harlan turned, he found the same answer. Everything's legal. Bring evidence. Prove a crime. 2 weeks later, on October 3, 1943, Delphine Crenshaw died. Cause of death: diabetic ketoacidosis and renal failure. She was 75 years old. 3 days before her death, she'd executed a will leaving her apartment to Vera Louise Carmody. The will had been prepared by a different attorney, Albert Rosenthal, who had an office near the hospital. When Harlan contacted him, Rosenthal was defensive. Mrs. Crenshaw came to my office voluntarily. She was of sound mind. Weak, yes, but lucid. She told me Miss Carmody had been caring for her, and she wanted to ensure the apartment went to her. I saw nothing improper. Rosenthal's voice turned sharp. __quote _101 _ Harlan attended Delphine's funeral. It was a small affair at Loudon Park Cemetery. Just Vera Carmody, a few neighbors, a minister. Vera wore black, stood with bowed head, eyes dry. She didn't look like a predator. She looked like a dutiful caretaker mourning a patient. After the service, as mourners dispersed, Harlan approached her. She turned to him, face impassive. Her voice was perfectly calm, with no trace of anger or fear. Vera agreed. She adjusted her black gloves. She walked away, leaving Harlan standing alone among the gravestones. She was right, of course. 2 weeks later, Vera Carmody came to his office to file probate on Delphine Crenshaw's will. Harlan processed the documents mechanically, his hands steady even though rage boiled inside him. When she left, he sat at his desk for a long time, staring at nothing. That evening, he told Dorothy he was going to continue investigating, no matter what it took. Someone has to stop her. At what cost, Harlan? Dorothy's face was lined with worry. Harlan had no answer. Over the following months, he became consumed by the case. He compiled detailed records of every death, every will, every timeline. He interviewed neighbors, building superintendents, anyone who might have information. He discovered that Vera didn't actually live at 412 Hollins. She had a small apartment across town near Union Memorial. She came to Hollins Street only when she had a patient. The pattern was consistent. She'd identify a target, begin providing care, gain their complete trust over several months, obtain a will, then remain with them constantly until they died. The deaths always occurred within weeks of the will being executed, just long enough to avoid obvious suspicion, but not so long that the elderly person might change their mind. Harlan found 2 more buildings where similar patterns had occurred, though not as concentrated. In each case, elderly residents with no family had died and left property to helpful neighbors or caregivers. One of those cases also involved Vera Carmody, dating back to 1940. She'd been doing this for at least 3 years, possibly longer. He compiled everything into a detailed report and brought it to the district attorney's office. An assistant DA named Paulson reviewed his materials. Paulson closed the file. It was something. Harlan returned to his files with renewed purpose. He began searching for relatives of the 5 victims, any children, siblings, cousins who might challenge the wills. It was painstaking work. Birth records, marriage licenses, census data. He spent weeks in city archives, libraries, courthouse basements. He found one lead. Bertram Stanhope, the first victim, had a younger sister still living in Washington, D.C. Harlan took the train down, found her in a small apartment near DuPont Circle. Mildred Stanhope was 70 years old, a retired school teacher. She hadn't spoken to her brother in 20 years after a family dispute, but when Harlan explained what had happened, her face went pale. Bertram left everything to a stranger? But we have family. I'm family. Did he know how to reach you? We weren't in contact. After Mother died, we had an argument about the estate. Stupid, really. I've regretted it for years, but I was too proud to make amends. Tears filled her eyes. And now he's gone. And some woman has his apartment? Mrs. Stanhope, if you're willing to challenge the will, I think we have grounds to claim undue influence. Challenge it? Could I win? Possibly. The timeline is suspicious. The isolation is suspicious. If we can demonstrate that Miss Carmody systematically manipulated your brother when he was vulnerable and alone, a judge might overturn the will. Then yes, absolutely yes. I want that woman stopped. Harlan filed a will contest in Baltimore Circuit Court. It was a small victory, but it felt like progress. The case would take months to resolve, but at least it was something. Meanwhile, at 412 Hollins, Ernest Blackwood remained barricaded in his apartment, refusing all visitors. Wilhelmina Dalton told Harlan that Ernest had become paranoid, wouldn't answer his door even for neighbors bringing groceries. Wilhelmina said, she was right. By trying to avoid becoming Vera's victim, Ernest had already become a different kind of victim, imprisoned by his own fear. In late December 1943, Harlan learned that Vera Carmody had acquired a sixth property. This one wasn't in the Hollins Street building. It was an apartment in a building on Charles Street, inherited from Marguerite Clausen, an 80-year-old widow who died of heart failure in November. Vera had filed the probate paperwork in December, just before Christmas. The pattern was identical. Vera had cared for Marguerite for 4 months, obtained a will in September, and Marguerite died in November. 2 months. Always 2 months. Harlan felt like he was watching a train wreck in slow motion, unable to stop it. He documented this case too, added it to his growing file. The DA's office told him the same thing. All legal, no crime, sorry. The will contest for Bertram Stanhope's estate proceeded through the court system. Harlan presented evidence of the pattern, the timeline, the isolation of the victims. Vera Carmody's attorney, a slick downtown lawyer named Preston Whitmore, argued that Vera had simply been a compassionate caregiver, and that elderly people often leave property to those who care for them. The judge seemed skeptical of Harlan's theory, as Whitmore dismissively called it. Mr. Jessup, you've shown that Miss Carmody was present during Mr. Stanhope's final months. You've shown that other people she cared for also left her property. But you haven't shown how she supposedly manipulated him. What did she do? What words did she say? How did she exert undue influence? Harlan struggled to articulate it. Your Honor, the pattern itself demonstrates. Pattern isn't proof, Counselor. You're asking this court to overturn a validly executed will based on suspicion. That's not how law works. The judge ruled in Vera's favor in March 1944. Mildred Stanhope wept in the courtroom. Harlan felt like he'd failed her. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He knew what Vera Carmody was, even if he couldn't prove it in court. He continued monitoring the buildings where she worked, warning anyone who would listen, documenting every case. It consumed him. His practice suffered. He neglected other clients, forgot appointments, lost cases he should have won. Dorothy begged him to let it go. But Harlan couldn't let go. The image of those manila folders haunted him. The empty calm in Vera Carmody's eyes. The sound of her voice through that apartment door, soft and relentless. In April 1944, Ernest Blackwood died. Not from Vera Carmody. He simply had a heart attack one night, alone in his apartment. Neighbors found him 3 days later. He'd left no will. The state claimed his property. Harlan wondered if fear had killed Ernest just as surely as any poison. Wilhelmina Dalton remained safe, protected by her weekly visits from her daughter. Vera never approached her. Predators, Harlan realized, were selective. They chose the vulnerable, the isolated, those with no one to notice or care. By the war's end in August 1945, Vera Carmody owned 9 properties in Baltimore. 9 elderly people who died after leaving her their apartments. Harlan had documented every case, filed reports with police, contacted the health department, written letters to newspapers. Some listened sympathetically. None acted. The world had won a great victory against tyranny abroad, while a different kind of tyranny continued unchecked at home. tyranny that wore a kind face and spoke soft words, tyranny that was perfectly, maddeningly legal. In September 1945, exactly 3 years after he'd first noticed the pattern, Harlan received a letter from Vera Carmody's attorney, Preston Whitmore. It was a cease and desist order, demanding that Harlan stop slandering Miss Carmody with his baseless accusations or face a lawsuit for defamation. He stared at the letter for a long time, then filed it away with the rest of his documentation. That evening, sitting on his front steps in Federal Hill, watching the sun set over the harbor, Harlan finally understood. He couldn't stop Vera Carmody. The law was on her side. Society was on her side. She'd found a perfect crime, exploitation so subtle, manipulation so gradual, destruction so invisible that it left no evidence. She turned loneliness into profit, despair into real estate. And she'd keep doing it, year after year, because no one could stop her. But he could save some. He could warn the vulnerable ones he found, educate people about the pattern, make it harder for predators like Vera to operate. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was what he could do. Over the years that followed, Harlan continued his work. He represented several families in will contests, winning a few, losing most. He gave lectures to social workers, wrote articles for legal journals about elder exploitation. He became known in Baltimore legal circles as the attorney who cared about elderly victims, who'd take cases other lawyers wouldn't touch. Agnes married a returning serviceman, gave Harlan 2 grandchildren. Dorothy's hair turned white, but she remained steadfast beside him, supporting his work even when it consumed their savings and his health. He never regretted the path he'd chosen, though it cost him dearly. Harlan Jessup practiced law until 1968, when arthritis finally forced his retirement at 77. He never stopped documenting cases like Vera Carmody's. His files eventually filled 3 cabinets in his study, hundreds of cases where elderly people had been systematically isolated and exploited. He shared his research with anyone who would listen: social workers, legal aid societies, district attorneys, journalists. Some listened. Most didn't, but a few did, and they carried his work forward, creating the first elder protection statutes in Maryland, establishing oversight mechanisms that hadn't existed before. Vera Carmody continued her work through the 1950s. By the time she herself died in 1959 at the age of 54, ironically, alone and in failing health, she owned 14 properties in Baltimore, all inherited from elderly people she'd cared for. She died in one of those apartments, surrounded by 14 deeds representing 14 lives converted into assets. The properties were sold, the proceeds distributed to distant relatives who'd never known her. Was there justice in her dying as alone as her victims? Perhaps, but it didn't change the fundamental truth. The system that enabled her continued operating. Because that's what this story is really about. Not Vera Carmody, not even Harlan Jessup's long crusade against her. It's about a society where elderly people become invisible, where loneliness is so common that predators can harvest it like a crop, where the law protects property rights more vigorously than it protects vulnerable human beings, where aging transforms people into targets and isolation becomes a commodity. This story is about how legal doesn't always mean right, how the absence of physical violence doesn't mean absence of harm, how words can kill as surely as poison, and neglect can be weaponized into a business model. It's about the space between what's lawful and what's moral, and how predators learn to operate in that space with impunity. Harlan saved one person definitively, Wilhelmina Dalton, who lived to be 93, surrounded by family. He warned dozens of others, prevented several wills from being executed, made Vera's work harder and slower. But he couldn't stop her entirely. The system was too strong, the law too rigid, the evidence too ephemeral. Yet his work mattered. The legal frameworks he helped establish, the awareness he raised, the families he represented, all of it contributed to change, slow and incremental, but real. Elder abuse laws, mandatory reporting requirements, probate oversight procedures. These didn't exist in 1943. But by the time Harlan retired in 1968, they were beginning to take shape, in part because of his tireless advocacy. The battle between predators and protectors never ends. It just changes shape, adapts to new times, new laws, new vulnerabilities. Somewhere right now, in this moment, an elderly person sits alone in an apartment, and someone with kind eyes and a soothing voice is saying, underscore underscore quote underscore 144 underscore underscore. And the elderly person, exhausted and lonely and afraid, says, underscore underscore quote underscore 145 underscore underscore. And another story begins, one that might end with a deed transfer and a death certificate. Or it might end differently, if someone notices, if someone cares, if someone has learned from Harlan Jessup's example that speaking up, even when the law seems powerless, is never meaningless. Because the fight against exploitation isn't measured in courtroom victories alone. It's measured in awareness raised, in warnings heeded, in one person saved who might otherwise have been lost. It's measured in the slow, grinding work of changing a system that too often values property over people, convenience over justice, legal formality over human dignity. Harlan Jessup died in 1971 at the age of 80. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun mentioned his long career in estate law, his service in the Great War, his family. It didn't mention his crusade against Vera Carmody, his hundreds of pro bono cases, his role in shaping Maryland's elder protection laws. History rarely records the quiet warriors, the ones who fight battles that generate no headlines, who win victories so incremental they're barely visible. But the work continues. Because as long as there are lonely elderly people and empty apartments, there will be those who see not human beings, but assets. Those who know how to wait, how to whisper, how to exploit the desperate human need for connection and care. And as long as those predators exist, there must be those who fight them, who document the patterns, who warn the vulnerable, who refuse to accept that legal is the same as right, who understand that the law is a tool, imperfect and often inadequate, but still worth wielding in defense of those who cannot defend themselves. This is not a story with a tidy ending. Vera Carmody was never prosecuted. Most of her victims' families never knew what happened. The system that enabled her still operates in modified form today. Evil wasn't vanquished. Justice wasn't fully served. But one person noticed. One person cared. One person spent years fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win because it was the right thing to do. And in the end, that matters. Not because it changed everything, but because it changed something. Because Wilhelmina Dalton lived. Because some families got their day in court. Because some laws were written. Because some people learned to recognize the pattern. That's the real story. Not the crime itself, but the response to it. Not the predator, but the protector. Not the deaths, but the lives saved. Not the failure of the law, but the refusal to accept that failure as final. Harlan Jessup couldn't stop Vera Carmody completely, but he made her work harder. He saved who he could save. He documented what he could document. He fought with the tools he had, imperfect as they were. And that, in the end, is all any of us can do. See the injustice, name it, fight it. Not because we'll win every battle, but because some battles must be fought regardless of the odds. Because somewhere, right now, someone is noticing a pattern. Someone is feeling that cold dread in their chest. Someone is opening a folder and seeing what others have missed. And maybe, just maybe, that person will remember stories like this one. Will remember Harlan Jessup. Will remember that speaking up, even when it seems futile, is never wasted. The work continues. The battle goes on. And every person who fights it, in whatever small way they can, honors the memory of those who fought before, who saw evil operating under cover of law and refused to look away. That's the inheritance. Not property, not money, not legal precedent, but the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that because something is legal, it must be tolerated. The insistence that human dignity matters more than procedural correctness. The belief that one person, armed with nothing but determination and a sense of justice, can still make a difference. Even if that difference is small, even if it's incomplete, even if it costs everything. Because in the end, what matters is not whether we succeed completely. What matters is that we tried, that we cared, that we fought, that when we saw someone suffering and no one else would help, we stepped forward anyway. That when the law failed and the system shrugged, we refused to walk away. That we bore witness, documented truth, and passed that knowledge to others who would continue the fight. That is Harlan Jessup's true legacy. Not the cases he won, but the example he set. Not the laws that bore his name, none did, but the awareness he raised, the seeds he planted, the path he cleared for others to follow. And somewhere in Baltimore today, an attorney opens a file and notices a pattern. An elderly person refuses help from a too helpful stranger. A social worker asks one more question. A family member contests a will they might have accepted. A law student reads about undue influence and thinks of Harlan Jessup's documented cases. The ripples spread outward from a single person's decision to care, to fight, to refuse to accept injustice simply because it wears a legal mask. That's how change happens. Not dramatically, not quickly, but person by person, case by case, year by year, until the system that seemed immovable finally shifts. Until the predators find it harder to hunt. Until the vulnerable have more protection. Until, quote, 148, quote, and, quote, 149, quote, move a little closer together. Until one more person is saved who might otherwise have been lost. That's the real story. That's the inheritance worth leaving. Not property, not money, but the stubborn, necessary belief that one person's moral clarity and determined action can still matter in a world that often seems indifferent to both. Harlan Jessup believed it, lived it, proved it, and left behind not courtroom victories or legal theories, but something more valuable. An example of what it means to see wrong and fight it, even when fighting seems futile. Especially then. Because that's when it matters most.